Over the course of just 48 hours, thousands of drivers swarmed petrol stations across India. In cities like Lucknow, daily fuel sales spiked by 67%. People were terrified the pumps were about to run dry. That exact same panic bled over into domestic cooking gas. The country's distribution network is built to handle about 50 lakh cylinders a day, but a wave of sudden hoarding completely overwhelmed that capacity. The spark for all this chaos was a speech by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He addressed Parliament about the need for wartime preparedness regarding global oil and gas supplies. But with memories of 2020 still fresh, the public misinterpreted his warning as the announcement of an imminent nationwide COVID-style lockdown. People were bracing to be trapped in their homes by a virus. They were actually watching the first ripples of an energy lockdown reach India's borders, a geopolitical threat that restricts access to power and fuel rather than physical movement. An energy lockdown occurs when external geopolitical conflicts choke off fuel supplies. Governments are forced to mandate the rationing of power and fuel, often ordering entire sectors to work remotely to keep critical infrastructure online. This is the current reality for several of India's neighbors. Pakistan has mandated a 4-day workweek for government employees. Vietnam has ordered factories to slash their power usage. And Thailand is restricting air conditioning while enforcing mandatory remote work to save electricity. Geographically, India sits in a vulnerable position. Between 40 to 45% of the country's crude oil and 90% of its imported liquid petroleum gas must sail directly through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most volatile maritime choke points on Earth. Given this reliance on a shipping lane sitting in a conflict zone, why hasn't India's power grid collapsed alongside its peers? The answer starts with a rapid macroeconomic pivot. Instead of waiting for Middle Eastern supply lines to snap, India immediately diversified its buyers, ramping up imports from producers in Africa, South America, and especially Russia. By late March, India's purchase of Russian crude oil had effectively doubled, reaching 2 million barrels per day, replacing the vulnerable Middle Eastern volume. This chart illustrates the first layer of the domestic defense. To insulate the nation against sudden maritime blockades, the government maintains a guaranteed 60-day strategic buffer of crude oil. Right next to it is a secondary buffer holding 25 to 30 days of liquid petroleum gas. This specific reserve is designed to prevent consumer shortages and keep domestic prices stable even if global shipping halts. By restructuring where it buys its fuel and sitting on massive strategic reserves, the state successfully absorbed the initial shockwaves of the Middle Eastern conflict. Securing the borders protects the supply, but the internal electrical grid provides the secondary defense. India's total capacity of 524 gigawatts operates almost entirely independently of imported natural gas. The primary anchor of that grid is domestic coal. Roughly 45% of the country's electricity is generated by enormous thermal power plants, burning fuel sourced directly from within India's own borders. To offset fossil fuel dependency, the grid is increasingly supported by renewable energy. Vast solar panel arrays are taking on a larger share of the load, further insulating the country from international oil volatility. That domestic electricity feeds directly into the logistics network. Over the last 15 years, India has electrified 99.4% of its broad-gauge railway system. This allows for initiatives like trucks on train. By rolling heavy road freight onto electric rail cars, the logistics sector moves away from expensive imported diesel, running on a grid that is nearly 70% cheaper to operate. By systematically electrifying its heaviest transportation sectors and powering them with domestic resources, India built an internal firewall against global oil shocks. But a national firewall is never completely airtight. While the macroeconomic shield protected the electrical grid, global inflation still found ways to bleed down into local communities. In the industrial hub of Coimbatore, a sharp shortage of commercial-grade LPG, meant to power machinery, had devastating effects. Without fuel, nearly 30% of the small and medium enterprises in the area were forced to shut their doors. The damage cascaded outward. Production costs in the local aluminum, steel, and glass sectors jumped by up to 25%. Restaurant overheads spiked without commercial gas, which directly slashed the daily income of local delivery workers by as much as half. While massive state-owned oil corporations can weather supply disruptions using millions of barrels in reserve, small businesses operating on razor-thin margins were left fighting for their survival. To stop the bleeding at the ground level, the government initiated a localized response, boosting the distribution of commercial LPG by 20% to support those struggling small industries. The long-term countermeasure is to eliminate the need for vulnerable truck-delivered cylinders entirely. The strategy is to hardwire the economy into the grid through the rollout of piped natural gas. Since the global conflicts began squeezing supply mines, the state has more than doubled the pace of this infrastructure. Daily installations have jumped from a historical average of 5,000 new connections to over 11,000 every single day. The panic at the petrol comps turned out to be unwarranted. It signaled a deeper transition already underway. India is restructuring how it powers its future to ensure the lights stay on regardless of global volatility.